Hi, welcome folks. I am Annabelle Linko, the chair for the National Science Policy Network's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. We, as you can see from the chat already, have posted the slides for you to view for today's talk, but we're also going to be having an awesome discussion. So this is just for your reference if you need to do. I am happy to welcome you back to one of our science policy webinars, one of our diversities, as we call them within the DEI committee. And I'm excited to see the conversation here today. I'll be off camera for the most part, as well as Jasmine Yu, who is our tech, but I want to give them a shout out there and the team as well, who have put this together. And so before I turn it all over, I do want to introduce folks to our awesome moderator for today. She isn't representing her particular institution as the moderator for today, but she is a biological administrator with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in the Division of Agriculture. Dr. Marcy Cockrell has also been involved with the DEI committee recently and has taken on this moderator position. But in her other position with the Florida Department of Agriculture, she works to enable sustainability, growth, development, and innovation in Florida's aquaculture industry and leads projects ranging from K-12 education to workforce development to marine debris reduction. So increasing diversity, equity, and accessibility in aquaculture and science more generally is a constant focus of her work. And she's been an engaged mentor and community organizer in the state of Florida to increase representation, equity, and access in science, particularly for young girls and women. Marcy holds a Ph.D. in marine science from the University of South Florida and was a science policy fellow with the National Academy's Gulf Research Program from 2018 to 2019. And I'm happy to have her take it away.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, and good afternoon, everyone. I am really excited to be here with everybody and act as your moderator this afternoon. This is my first event officially with the DEI committee with the National Science Policy Network, so I'm really excited to be part of this event. So in planning this webinar, the team used this policy position paper that you see up on your screen from Dr. Andrew Crain as a framework. Inclusive Science Policy and Economic Development in the 21st Century, the Case for Rural America. This paper was the winner of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance special issue entitled Shaping the Future of Science Policy this past August. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Crain with us here today, and I'll introduce him along with our other panelists in just a minute. So this policy memo will set the frame for our discussion today, so I wanted to just touch on the paper briefly. So we'll be examining the need for greater equity in scientific investment and education between rural and urban America. So this paper speaks to the unequal distribution in scientific investment and economic development between urban and rural communities in the United States over the past about 75 years. The history and the challenges of equitable science policy making for rural America are discussed in the paper with a particular focus on education and economic development, and includes examples of federal investments in science, development of the land-grant university system, the geographic distribution of research universities, growth in digital technologies and the digital divide, and persistent income inequality between rural and urban communities. Various structural barriers and policy solutions are discussed in the paper, and I know Dr. Crain will be presenting on some of those today, so I don't want to give any spoilers. The quote you see on the screen was pulled from the paper, and I think summarizes our framework for today's webinar really nicely. The benefits of scientific innovation have not been fully realized in all corners of the United States. In particular, rural America persistently lags behind other locales in terms of scientific investment and economic development. In the coming decades, more place-conscious science policy will be needed to provide equal opportunities and equal benefits to all. According to the 2010 census, 19% of Americans live in places considered rural. So this topic is not only timely, but critical for ensuring equity in education, economic development, and access to scientific achievements for all Americans in the 21st century. Something especially interesting to me that I learned while reading this paper, there were many, many interesting things, but there are different definitions of what constitutes rural, depending on the application or the institution that's operationalizing that definition. So that's really interesting context for this discussion. So I would encourage all of our attendees to take a few minutes to read the paper after the webinar to learn more about this topic. And we are going to drop the link for the paper as well as the full issue of JSPG that the paper was in. So I see that Jasmine dropped that in the chat. So with that, we are going to introduce our panelists for today. So go ahead to the, thank you, Jasmine. All right, so today's panel is a really prestigious group. I'm really excited to hear from all of you. So first, and we have Andrew Crain. So Andrew is the Director of Experiential Professional Development in the University of Georgia Graduate School, where he supports graduate student career development in areas beyond the tenure track. Andrew holds a doctoral degree in higher education from the Louise McBee Institute of Higher Education at UGA, with a research focus on college access and equity for rural students, STEM talent development, and higher education policy. Andrew is originally from Missouri and holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Missouri State University. Next up, we have Tyler Hallmark. Tyler is a proud citizen of the Cherokee Nation, born and raised in rural Oklahoma. A first-generation college graduate, former Pell Grant recipient, and Gates Millennium Scholar, Tyler received his BA from the University of Colorado Boulder, his M.S.Ed from the University of Pennsylvania, and his Ph.D. from the Ohio State University. Tyler's efforts to shed light on historically overlooked rural populations have earned recognition in diverse issues in higher education and led to his appointment by the Ascendium Education Group to an advisory board tasked with establishing a national rural post-secondary research agenda. Presently, Tyler serves as a program associate with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, where he helps oversee a portfolio of more than $10 million, seeking to effectively advance diversity, equity, inclusion in STEM graduate education. And last but certainly not least, we have Vanessa Sansone. Vanessa is an assistant professor of higher education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She is an expert on racial, spatial, and class disparities related to higher education student retention, access, success, and how institutional, state, and national policies impact these issues. In 2020, she was named as one of the 35 most outstanding women in higher education by Diverse Issues in Higher Education. She has been recognized by the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education and the Texas Association of Chicanos in Higher Education as a top Latina graduate scholar, among many other honors. She currently serves as the Director of Policy for the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges and as the elected member at large on the ASHE Council on Public Policy in Higher Education. She holds a doctorate in educational leadership and an M.S.Ed in educational leadership and policy studies, both from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and a BA in sociology from St. Mary's University in San Antonio. And if you could believe it, I had to cut down those bios because these folks have so many great things on their resume. All right. We can go ahead to the next slide, Jasmine. So I just wanted to reiterate for everybody what the format's going to be. So each speaker is going to have 3 to 5 minutes for their opening remarks. I know, Dr. Crain, you have some slides that we've got loaded up for you here. We'll then have about 30 minutes for moderated Q&A. So we have some questions prepared, but we'll certainly be taking questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll be watching those as we go through. So with that, we will start with Dr. Crain with your opening remarks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cockrell, for the introduction. And I was excited about this conversation before, but now I'm even more excited and maybe a little nervous after hearing those bios and all the great things that y'all have done. So thanks for being here. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. I wanted to begin with just a little additional framing about my interest in this topic and sort of how that came to be. So as my bio mentioned, I am from Missouri. I grew up in small town Missouri, and I think that really influenced my choice to study issues of rural access and equity in my higher education graduate studies. So I was focused on researching college choice, and I have to admit, my original intent was not to study issues of STEM, but in my conversations around college going in general, STEM kept coming up. And this is a good example that I thought just sort of captured that. This is a quotation from my dissertation. A student that I interviewed, my research was focused in part on Black Belt communities in the Southeast. So this is one of those students who came from a rural community there. The name Cedar Bluff here is a pseudonym, but she said from her experiences in high school and a lot of her science classes, she didn't get what a lot of other students got, things like hands-on labs, getting to do different experiments, actually having chemistry classes or physics classes or courses dedicated to some of these subfields. She said you just kind of do the bare bone basics, and then when you get to college, you're expected to have already done these things, and you just sort of laugh and say, no, I didn't get that. So this is sort of a reoccurring theme that I was noticing in these other conversations. And when the call came out to do a position paper, a policy paper, and the topic was science policy, it really made me think that maybe there was a chance to kind of re-envision some of these issues of rural education and access in terms of science policy and think about it under a different policy lens than maybe we had done before. That's what I attempted to do in the paper. Next slide, please. So I talk about, in general, thinking about ways that sort of society is divided between rural and urban, and I think in terms of access to scientific innovation, that'll probably come up in our conversation as we go through the day. But then I focus specifically on the paper on issues of education and education policy. So this is just an example that I thought I would kind of zoom in on from the paper that I mentioned briefly, kind of expanding on that idea a little bit more. This is a study from the Educational Commission of the States that shows in this graph access to AP coursework in any subject. The green is just access to AP courses, and the orange represents whether they took an exam. So you see here between rural and urban or suburban settings, this big gap. It's almost a 20% gap in this case, or roughly a 20% gap in terms of accessing AP courses, and over a 10% gap when it comes to taking AP exams in any area. On the next slide, it's the same information, but really just focused on STEM. And when you look at this data, it shows, again, in this instance, if you look at rural and suburban in that last year, that gap is 30% in terms of just accessing a STEM AP course. And again, you see the gap there of 10 or more percent in terms of taking an AP exam. So when we think about, again, what the student anecdote, and then you look at data like this, it starts to paint a bigger picture of, what happens to rural students when they arrive on college campuses, thinking about everything that goes into a STEM career path, and socialization toward those careers. I think there's a real possibility here that a lot of rural students are kind of being cooled out of those opportunities before they even really come out of the gate. And something I think that maybe we should think about a little bit more as educators. On the next slide, everything I've just described is maybe something that you could just label academic capital, the academic forms of knowledge or resources that you have to move in that direction in terms of STEM careers. And when we look at other aspects of rural communities, there are maybe other things that we would start to identify from a policy standpoint that would be helpful here. So I've just outlined a few, and some of these are things, again, that I touch upon in the paper. social capital, the resources that you're able to tap through your network. Naturally, in a small town, you probably have less exposure to role models in STEM careers. And again, for socialization, that's important to expose students or attract students to those opportunities. Even just in terms of pathways to college, there's less exposure or access to folks that have college degrees. The data shows that there are fewer folks with college degrees. Cultural capital, again, when it comes to socialization, rural students may be kind of dissuaded in some ways. Research shows that maybe they're sometimes encouraged to do something more practical or do something directly after high school, go find a job instead of going and studying somewhere. Of course, that varies a lot based on family settings and family dynamics, but this is a theme that comes up, in rural literature sometimes, and something that I think is particularly relevant to STEM, especially if folks, family members, don't have that exposure to what those careers look like in their immediate surroundings. And in the paper, I talk a lot about economic structures and kind of economies of scale, the diversification of rural communities in terms of not only folks learning about STEM careers, but being able to go back and work in those career fields in their communities, I think is something that we should really think about more. And also kind of from a policy standpoint, how we use economies of scale to create opportunities. So I just talked about AP coursework. That's a problem of economies of scale, right? You need maybe a certain large enough pool of students to be able to justify offering those things, or you need to have a large enough school to have certified teachers. But even when it comes to grant funding and other things, there are challenges related to economies of scale that we should think about from a policy standpoint. So in the last slide, I'm over my time, but this is just an example, one example of something that is mentioned in brief in the paper, which is, we can focus on education policy, starting from the larger umbrella of STEM policy, and then through education policy in particular, there are ways maybe we can shore up some of these challenges in rural settings. There's something called this triple helix model of innovation, and post-secondary education, as you see here, is a big part of that, right? So that's one of the things I talk about is maybe we should think about under the science policy umbrella, coordinating these things in a more cohesive way.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so next for opening remarks, we'll move on to Dr. Hallmark.
Yeah, hi everyone, thank you for having me. As I mentioned, I'm Tyler Hallmark, and I'm coming to you today from New York City, the ancestral homelands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, and numerous other indigenous groups that have lived here over the years. I think it's really interesting hearing Andrew's background into this because it resonates so much with my own. As someone who has come from a lot of different backgrounds that can be considered marginalized, being a rural student, being someone from a low-income household, being first generation, and being indigenous, some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and then I read Andrew's paper, putting this in the rural context specifically, these themes still kept coming up for me of how the 2 points I'll make here in a minute can be applied to so many different groups. I'll be applying them specifically in the rural context, but they really resonate with me from Andrew's paper, and I think you all could probably see some of this as well. And I will say both of these points apply to some of my current work. I'm currently working now in STEM. Actually, I work in STEM philanthropy, where my focus is on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM graduate education specifically. So I'm constantly working with grantees on how we can improve education for different groups and get them into STEM. And I think some of these points have been really coming up in my work here, but when I read these policy paper, they really resonate with policy as well. The first thing I want to say is that really stuck out to me is the privilege that comes when we ask for innovation. Who has the privilege to innovate? We've had this conversation come up with some of my grantees where, I'll be talking with advisory board about funding certain grantees at minority serving institutions, under-resourced institutions, et cetera. And some of these grantees will turn to me and say, well, this proposal doesn't seem very innovative. We already know mentoring matters. Why am I only just seeing another proposal about mentoring? Why am I only seeing another proposal about getting students research experience? And I ask them, well, what's your educational background? And they, often are these people that have come from urban, prestigious institutions like Harvard and MIT and the California system, and I say, well, you've had these things in place. At some of these institutions, they're just trying to get basic things covered because they've been so historically under-resourced that they don't have the privilege to innovate. You already have a research experience built in when you're going to Harvard. You already have a mentoring network built in, and a formalized mentoring network, I will say. Whereas some of these institutions don't have that for their students. And I think the same thing about policy. If we're only looking to fund policy or put policies in place that are promoting innovation without first covering the basic needs of rural areas, I think we really need to do a privilege check there in that regard. I think about in the article, it talks about how only 1 out of 264 universities with high research activities are located in rural areas. Well, if you're only going to fund, what's that mean for, all those rurally located institutions that don't have the basic infrastructure to take on high research activity? If you're only going to create grants, if you're only going to create policies that are affecting those with high research activity, you're missing a huge part of the country. And the second thing I'll say is I've been pushing people to really think about how they're assessing and evaluating whether that you make a grant or whether you put a certain policy in place. And I think so many of the ways we assess or we bring to conversation privileges urban-centric areas that we completely overlook how it's impacting rural communities. I'll give you an example. So often in policy discussions, one of the most popular questions you'll hear is this cost effective? And I think if we base everything on whether it's cost effective, we're not going to help those groups that need the most help. And and we see the same thing with some of the arguments happening now. There was the recent argument to get rid of the United States Postal Service and privatize that. And my question was, as someone who grew up out there, none of the big companies would come to my area. FedEx wouldn't deliver to my house. UPS wouldn't deliver to my house because it wasn't cost effective to them. There wasn't enough people there for them to invest in those areas. So it's not always, but it doesn't mean I shouldn't get my mail, right? So it's not always a cost effective measure to serve rural areas, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I love seeing this, write up about the country life movement. And I think that's part of what they're really saying there is that we should really be investing in these rural areas, despite what, our normal assessment questions would ask. So those are two things that really resonated with me at this point. And those are 2 points I want to start off with today. And one other thing I will just end on a quick note is I really appreciated Andrew's point in his paper where he talks about also, moving away from rural as agriculture and seeing rural as more diverse than just agricultural industries. And I think this is important for STEM too, that we don't always have to tie STEM to agriculture to locate them in rural communities. I think there's so much opportunity there. And if we're only seeing rural as agriculture, then what's that say about the infrastructure we've provided rural to be something else? We don't tie urban to one set field. And I don't think we should do that for rural either. I think there's a lot of possibilities there. And that's the final notes I'll end on for now. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. And you've already got my wheels going with our moderator questions over here. So I'm very excited to jump into the discussion. And Dr. Sansone, your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Two things strike me with Dr. Crain's paper. One of the things that he touches on, but I think it's worth bringing forward a little bit more, is this discussion about rural and racial inequality or equality. As he mentioned in his position paper, that a lot of this also has to talk about, when we talk about rural, we tend to think about it in terms of being race evasive, but it's not. Communities of color tend to cluster, and there's a historical piece of rural areas being highly populated by racialized communities. We can think about this in terms of the Delta Mississippi, where Black rural Americans live, along the South Texas-Mexico border, where predominantly rural Latinx populations live, also inclusive of where indigenous population, Native Americans live, right? And so the conversation in terms of investing in education and science, there's also a racial conversation here, because as his paper touched on with regards to where innovation and where infrastructure is being looked at, when we start to map it out in terms of race and where racial communities reside, we start to get a different side to this picture of it being racially inequitable for Black and Brown and Native American Indigenous students. And so with the investment of, thinking about science and increasing science diversity, there has to be that component too, because race is in the conversation when we talk about rural geographies or rural locales. The other point too is also, we tend to think about this a lot of times in terms of the student being the focus of the conversation. What can we do more in terms of what can students do more? And Dr. Crain's paper really starts to make us think more about a broader perspective of how do we think about this from an organizational standpoint. The example that he used a minute ago is bringing in AP dual credit curriculum into the K through 12 settings in rural areas. But also his point in the paper that when we look at the research intensive institutions, the 200 and something, there's only one located in a rural area. So that gets into the conversation of recent work that I'm working on along with my colleagues with the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges, where we are starting to focus on thinking about assessment incorporating rural serving. So what does it mean to be a rural serving institution? We can think about this in terms of the federal classifications of historically Black college university or Hispanic serving institution. We're working on this project right now where we're trying to assess institutions who are serving rural areas well. And when we think about it in terms of science, we can begin to see, are they bringing in, doing the work to bring in not only innovation and jobs, as well as educated workforce to rural regions, but, they don't necessarily have to be located in a rural area, the institution itself. They could be adjacent and still be serving rural areas and rural communities. And so those are the two things that Dr. Crain's paper has brought up for conversation in my head about, the case for rural America and why there's an imperative need to begin to focus more science investment, particularly funding for infrastructure to enhance science representation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I think those opening comments really help kind of set the stage for our discussion. So I'm really excited with where we're going to go. I wanted to start with one of the questions that we were thinking about in planning this webinar and topics we wanted to touch on. I think all of you really hit on this a little bit, especially with the comment, who has the privilege to innovate? I think that's a really interesting way to frame this discussion about funding mechanisms. So what do we need to do? How do we need to change these funding mechanisms? Be they governmental, private, public, whatever they are, the funding mechanisms to better address equity in science education and science policy. Who has the privilege to innovate, thinking about how grant outcomes are assessed, or how a grant application is evaluated to get funding. And I think tied into that a little bit when we think about funding mechanisms and who's getting that funding, if it's going to these big urban R1 universities, they then do the research. They're the ones who have then the privilege to innovate, right? So how can we be better at leveraging and representing the skills and the talent and the enormous knowledge and expertise at our HBCUs, at our minority serving institutions, which are often, are connected to rural communities and the historically, marginalized, currently marginalized communities that a lot of us are trying to reach. So I will kick it to Dr. Sansone to start. I know that was a big lofty question, but I'll kick it to you first.
Yeah, no, this fits in right into the realm of, when we talk about policy, we tend to forget about the power of the funders, right? And so I think, Dr. Hallmark can speak more to the nitty gritty, but this is something that I think the three panelists here would agree upon, that there's inequity and unfairness in the funding process. I'm at a University of Texas at San Antonio. It honestly today just released that it has become an R1, but I've been here for a while. And prior to us becoming a research intensive institution, we struggled to maintain the capacity, like Dr. Hallmark was talking about, to do the research, but also in terms of outreach to the rural regions, which we do serve in South Texas, a vast South Texas region. We serve rural communities. The ability to get out there and make sure that we're doing service, doing justice to the rural communities that we're serving. A prime example is not only in terms of outreach and in increasing the pathway and the pipeline to STEM workforce and majors, but also is just having curriculum, right? I use my institution as an example all the time, but we're the only institution within a vast region that does serve rural areas that does not have a PhD in math, that does not have, these programs that are really important in terms of the pathway and the pipeline, the trajectory. These are things that matter, particularly when they are adjacent to rural regions, because this is also the investment back into these communities. Similar to, Dr. Crain's work, I've done research on rural college access, and many of the students that I work with mention how they make decisions based on where programs and opportunities are located. And they're making more decisions about those institutions that are somehow giving back in some way to their rural communities. So a prime example is I had a student who, brilliant student, probably could have gone anywhere, but wanted to go to the regional college because there was a program that tied health, rural health back to the rural community, because he has lived in a rural community that unfortunately the one doctor had passed away and they had been left without a physician for years. And so he's having that experience, he's wanting to fill that. And so it's these examples that, although an annotated example and case study example, but these are the things that funders should consider about what is innovative, what is serving, what is of value. There has to be reciprocity between the institution and the rural community and its members. And those are the things that funders should be considering, which I understand there's a history here, so they're going to have to unlearn in order for us to create more equity. And so, again, Dr. Hallmark and Dr. Crain can speak more to this, but that's I think is a really good example of where this matters in terms of who has power in the funding process.
Yeah, that's great. I love that concept of unlearning that process. Dr. Hallmark or Dr. Crain, did you want to add on to that? And then we've got some great audience questions starting to roll in as well.
Sure. I will just say, I think there's a couple things we can do with the funding mechanism. First off, and I'm currently working on a piece on this in regard to minority serving institutions, but again, I think many of the lessons translate to rural serving institutions, rurally located institutions, et cetera. And the first thing I would say is, I think it's time when we're trying to invest in research and in practice in these areas, to make sure that money is actually going to people that live and work in these areas. And, I see another time that someone hires a researcher from Harvard to go do research in a rurally located place, that's not who should be getting the money. I think we need to be giving the money to those that are actually rurally located. So that's one thing I'll say. Similarly, a lesson that I've learned, we recently did a call this past year where we did minority serving institutions pathways program, where we would, create graduate pathways for undergraduates from MSIs to go on to STEM graduate education, often at PWIs. And many times we got partners. I think it's a great way to encourage partnership for many institutions that don't have basic infrastructure in certain areas to partner with someone. But on those, you got to be aware of where the money's going, and that these, under-resourced institutions, these rurally located institutions, minority serving institutions, aren't just being leveraged as, almost like a gimmick to get the money for the big institution, and you can see that and how budgets are really laid out. So I think reading deeply on these kind of collaborations that are happening and make sure it's truly mutually beneficial, and especially beneficial for the rural community. Those are a couple things there. On the larger scale, I would say, to shift funding mechanisms, we also really need to establish infrastructure, and that includes funding things like internet service in rural areas. I think if anything we've learned from this pandemic is how many of our jobs we can be doing online. But, when we say that, I've been working online a lot for the last year. But that's a privilege I have because I've been urban, located in urban areas. But I think if we expanded, these kind of offerings, necessary internet, necessary infrastructures to rural areas, I think they can engage a lot more deeply. I think we could put a lot more money into rural communities so they can really engage in STEM work and research and et cetera, et cetera. So those are a few things I will say on that front. But I think, my first point, we have to really be prioritizing getting money in these areas. And similarly, on this institutional front, I think we really need to question our assumptions about why only R1s are seen as capable of doing rural work or capable of doing high quality work. There are so many great non-high, research activity institutions that are just doing great work. They have great researchers at them, et cetera. And I think we could really fund that and really bolster them and in many ways.
Wonderful. Dr. Crain, did you want to?
I'll add just briefly so we can get to audience questions. But, I think, what I mentioned in the paper is just simplifying funding mechanisms. And I think anytime that we force institutions to compete for resources, we pave the way for stratification to happen. So, thinking about your typical R1 university, we've been talking about how those places are better positioned to pursue grants. And in the case of science policy, they're also better positioned to lobby for state support. They're in better position to pursue philanthropic donations from donors and other folks. And so engaging with industry, corporate partners. So all these ways that institutions chase resources, feed into that issue of layering within the higher education landscape. And even if institutions within a state system, for example, all have the same level of per student funding, which even that is often not the case, there's still stratification that is added on top of that because of this infrastructure. And so, the very short and sweet kind of summary to that is, I think, not forcing, whenever possible, not forcing institutions to go out and sort of eat what they kill, and more just baseline support for higher education. I think at the end of the day is always something that is going to help reduce those inequities.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. All right, so we're going to take an audience question here. So Samantha says, ooh, I just lost the Q&A box. Hold on. Okay, so Samantha says, thank you for all your time and sharing your expertise today. STEM education seems to focus on providing opportunities that tend to take the student out of their rural communities and into more urban communities. I'm curious to hear each of your opinions on policy paths that can help students from rural communities engage in STEM career paths that bring their expertise back to their communities in meaningful ways. So I know we've started to touch on this a little bit already, So let's go ahead. We'll go in reverse order. Why don't we start with Dr. Crain this time?
Sure, yeah, I could talk about this a lot because this is an important topic. And I work, my full-time job is in career development. I've always worked in the career development space as a practitioner, and I think about this quite a bit. So this is where, again, I think sort of a multifaceted approach is really important because there's a lot of factors that feed into this out-migration kind of phenomenon. So yes, it's important to place rural students and help them succeed in STEM career tracks, but we're not necessarily helping those communities in the long term if we're just pulling the best talent out constantly, which is really what happens. So for example, in the paper, I talk about, how can we kind of diversify rural economies. Agriculture is kind of what we all think of. Actually, that's lower on the list in terms of what's typical in a rural economy. If you look at the nation as a whole, it tends to be things like service, retail, K-12 education. Those are some of the top employers. And so again, can we attract, STEM startups to relocate in those spaces? There's maybe policy incentives we could create. Can we maybe invest more in regional hubs that will at least allow for growth kind of at that regional scale? That will help in part, to retain some of that talent. And the more you do that, you start to create this knowledge spillover that it feeds into itself. So that's ultimately the goal. Dr. Sansone talked about unlearning, and I think when it comes to education, and again, I mentioned career services, we have some unlearning to do when it comes to our role in tracking students out of their communities. So if you are a rural student studying business, studying science at an R1 university, you'll probably get lots of different ways to engage and prepare for career paths, and you'll have a menu of opportunities placed in front of you throughout your time as a student. Most likely, almost all, if not all of those opportunities will be in an urban setting or something that leads you away. Rarely, I think, would a menu of opportunities be placed in front of you that has options to go back to your community. Places like medical schools are thinking more about this with dedicated programs for rural talent, but there's a long way to go in rethinking how we structure those pathways. So those are a couple comments, and again, you can see maybe how there's multiple kind of prongs of policy that would need to be kind of integrated to support this type of outcome.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Hallmark, please.
Yeah, sure. I will. I mean, ditto to what Andrew said. A few other things I'll say is just going back to the university setting. I think there are more and more. I think we're learning ways that many institutions for years have had this idea about letting students do their own projects, research projects, or community practice projects, et cetera, based on their own communities. And I think there's increasing ways we can do that in rural communities. And I've seen this in some of my own proposals that have been coming across my desk lately about institutions that are still able to provide the online learning, online mentorship as students are actually located in their institution and their communities. So I guess my question is why do we have to take them out at all? Like they could actually stay there and still get their learning, their mentoring, and engaging in these practices and research while staying in their own community the whole time. Granted, they have internet access, and we, are building more infrastructure in that regard. So that's one thing I will say. And second, I think it goes back to, again, really funding and building out infrastructure at rurally located institutions so that students can stay and engage in different practice and research-based community projects from these institutions that are located there. And, I think we're starting to see more rurally located institutions start opening their own research labs and their own, place-based internships and that kind of stuff there. So I think there's a lot of promise in that area if we continue to fund those and let them build. The final thing I'll say is also being sure to engage with private partners. I saw some really awesome work being done recently where some water treatment centers across rural Arizona, the rural Southwest, started opening internship placements for students in rural areas. So this is showing students that, work in STEM, that are studying STEM in college, that they can actually get an internship at these places right where they live. And I think that's really awesome. And I think we have, as Andrew mentioned, there's already a lot of diversity in rural economies. It's just time we start embracing that and start offering opportunities that we've been seeing at urban centers for a while. And so some of that can be like, if a water treatment center didn't have an internship program, how do you go about creating one? And how do you go about recruiting rural students to, participate in it? And so those are a few ideas there.
I'll make it even more succinct and direct, but I'll use like what Samantha asked here. And I'll just say this, that policy paths that help students from rural communities engage in STEM career paths that bring their expertise back to their rural communities in meaningful ways need to get more funding. That's basically it, because that is the innovation. I mean, at the end of the day, there are pathways, and these paths can differ through urban serving institutions that serve urban communities and urban regions. But those tend to be a little bit more, what we've seen, those are what we've seen. And, Dr. Crain's paper speaks to this, right? That most of this has also, the focus of the research has led a bent to understanding, or at least seeing this through an urban centric lens in terms of policy with regards to science and innovation. And so these are the programs that need to get more funding. That's my opinion on it. Those that are somehow being innovative and creative to take the curriculum or take the outreach programs, anything of that sort that can somehow bring the capital back to the rural communities are what is needed right now. That's what is needed. And, Dr. Hallmark pointed to, indigenous Southwest rural Native communities that are, doing work in terms of water resources, because if anything that needs to be mentioned, that rural regions geographically, the landscape is different. It differs completely from urban centers. So if it's a different geographic region that has to do with different, experiences and environments, then policies and programs that are focused on science, education, whatever it is really, that are created in urban centers, it's not going to work in rural regions. Like, it's not. There's some things, of course, like mentoring, right? All that kind of stuff. But if you don't have broadband, how are you going to, operate then in similar ways in an urban center? And I always mention this in my talks. It's not to say that, we're not pitting urban against rural. Urban, particularly inner city urban areas, still struggle on many of these, but the geography and the landscape differs. I myself grew up in poverty. I'm actually from an urban center, and I didn't have internet either, but it was much easier for me to jump on a public transportation of some sort and go to the library or go to, an institution of higher education, because there were several, in my community. And yes, it was an uplift and, a barrier, but it was much easier versus the rural students that I work with. The closest public access broadband was about 45 minutes away. And that's if they could somehow find a ride to the nearest public library. So these are the ways where it differs, and this difference is unique to rural spaces, and it has to be considered. And again, it's not pitting against rural against urban, it's just different.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And what I'm hearing is that we need to plan a whole nother webinar that talks about infrastructure and access to resources. Yeah, that's fantastic. We have another question. We have a question and a comment from Blair. So the comment is, as a marine scientist originally from rural Kentucky, thank you for discussing issues that particularly resonate with my experience in STEM. And her question is, I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on interdisciplinary STEM education efforts in rural communities, can nature-based or land stewardship experiences be an opportunistic way to utilize resources in rural areas? I think that's especially interesting question in the context of the place-based learning and the place-based opportunities that we were just talking about. So if anybody has any particular thoughts and wants to start us off on this question, please jump in.
I can start. We mentioned that this is where the innovation lies in terms of science and of course in understanding diversity in the profession too, right? The science profession. And so one of the things I think also is of consideration is the public good that can happen too, and this. The focus of the nature-based land stewardship and those experience, these are unique ways that rural institutions or rural communities can serve, and that service can be tied to curriculum in different ways that we think of. Instead of being necessarily in the classroom and just lecturing, actually getting out and doing and thinking of ways in which it gives back to the community. So yes, to your point or your question, Blair, about, is this an opportunistic way to utilize resources in rural areas? Most definitely. And we've seen this in some rural serving institutions. And again, these are the ones that unfortunately are not uplifted as a model for innovation, particularly in regards to science. But they need to be, they really need to be. And, I'm sure, again, my colleagues can talk about this more because they focus on funding and then career services. But I do think that this is an opportunistic way for them to realize and uplift their natural resources.
I'll just say definitely. I especially see this with Indigenous communities and a lot of Indigenous initiatives really taking advantage of this and leaning on this. And I will say especially important to highlight this whole interdisciplinary and recognizing multiple STEM fields. I think that's almost it's a catch-22 of, it's a shame we've almost limited ourselves to agricultural sciences are what take place in these areas, but also it's a shame that those are the sciences that are taking the most action to reach rural places. I think, so many other disciplines should be really thinking critically about how they can apply their work in rural settings, because, math applies to everything we do in life. Why can't you go design a math camp in a rural location and, be innovative in that sense? And I will say, I've been seeing most of these innovations that are really taking place using nature and land-based activities are, often Indigenous initiatives going to work on tribal reservations. But I think we can think about this in so many different ways to be innovative and across disciplines in these communities. So to answer your question, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I think those comments are spot on. And I'll just add a brief aside. I think everything Tyler said, especially about Indigenous practices and how that can inform place-based education, is a really interesting idea. And if we zoom out a little bit, I think it also connects to the larger importance of kind of framing these challenges in different ways, right? So if you think about the conversation around the Green New Deal, there were certainly efforts, at least I saw, to show rural communities how there were things in that would help lead to new career paths and investment in all areas of the country. And that was sort of one of the concepts. And I know that's still politically a contentious policy agenda. Maybe we need a rural New Deal that really even more explicitly reframes those ideas and talks not only about conservation and sustainability, but other forms of investment and infrastructure. So there are lots of different ways to think about these challenges. And I think your question kind of gets at, we can do that from a policy standpoint, we can do that from a curriculum standpoint. And I appreciate that idea.
Yeah, that sounds great. And something that we've kind of started to touch on, or it's been mentioned in all of your comments in one way or the other, is this disconnect between what folks might think is happening in rural communities, right? That it's just agriculture, it's just farming, and what's actually really driving the economy in rural communities. And so, with increasing or steady federal investments in agriculture in these communities, but a decline in agricultural jobs, what is accounting for that disconnect? Why are we continuing to invest in agriculture or extension programs in agriculture in rural communities when that's really not what's moving the economic development in these communities forward? Where's that disconnect, and what do we need to do to make up that gap? In 5 minutes, in 5 or 6 minutes.
I think Andrew can probably speak more to this, but I'll say briefly, I think a big disconnect comes from the people who are making the laws and being urban centric, being urbanly located themselves, and trying to explain away policies instead of actually listening to the people that live in these areas. I think that's a big part of it. And I think it comes down to also how we, how our elections are set up in a lot of ways. So.
And I would say too, to add on, because it's all policy, but agriculture has a big arm in policy too. And so there's a big push, in terms of, lobbyists for, the farming industry has a huge, it has a huge sounding board in terms of the government. And so how they focus and dictate how they want to frame what they want and need, how it falls into higher education it's kind of, again, these historical policies that are interchangeable and interlapping on each other that, that Dr. Crain notes with the Moral Land Grant Act, and that being historically a policy intended to serve rural areas, but that was their main, focus for so long, agriculture and technical. But demographics have changed, times have changed. And so how have these historic policies still played into these national conversations in terms of moving science or seeing it different in rural areas too? And again, how education plays into that.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think that's great. And I was going to mention the Morale Lane grant. I think Dr. Sansone's point earlier about unlearning things, a lot goes back to that. We just have this long tradition of investing for good reasons in that area, in that policy area. And, maybe it's something that if you look at how policies are developed, there's a lot of, probably reasons there are bipartisan agreement for those investments, and both sides of the table can see how they win through investing in that area. But again, as we've talked about, what does it actually look like at the community level? And it's become, as agriculture becomes more capitalized, this really extractive relationship, and everything is more corporatized. And so, I think it really is just going to require some bold re-envisioning and some bold investment to not necessarily take away from that area, but what are other areas that we need to invest in a similar manner?
Yeah, I think that's an important point too. And I certainly did not mean that question to come across to disparage agriculture at all. It is an incredibly important industry, and it's an important cultural touchstone in a lot of communities, and a generational touchstone for a lot of families. But it's an interesting point to think it's only one piece of a broad portfolio of the economy in rural communities, and a growing portfolio. We think about digital infrastructure, and especially for this conversation, growing a STEM workforce, growing a education workforce that can teach our next generation of STEM students. So I think it's an interesting piece to think about. Oh, Dr. Crain, please.
I was just going to interject and add, for folks that are interested in this topic, there's this really interesting book I found, and for some reason I just happen to remember the title. It's called Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times. And it talks about, it's written in the 70s, but it talks about this issue, and it sort of gives a very critical, it's pretty scathing actually, review of ag policy and kind of the history behind it, and kind of explores this extractive relationship. So it's a really interesting kind of thought-provoking read, and if you have it in your library, have access to it, I would point you to that resource. Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times.
Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times. Great. Thank you so much for that recommendation. So we have, let's see if we can answer one last question here in just our last few minutes before we wrap up. There was a question specifically about the figure that you presented, Dr. Crain, in the 3 points. The question is, in the trifecta figure, are there other points that can replace the university point?
Yeah, I mean, that's just one model of, a model of economic development. And I think really it says university, it should really be post-secondary education. So that's a sort of misnomer in terms of the image that I used. But I actually just pulled that image from the Wikipedia page about the triple helix model. But if you go to that page, it talks about, if you look up triple helix innovation, it talks about quadruple or other kind of iterations of that bring in other ideas and other stakeholders. And I think those are good starting points to kind of think about, adding structure to these conversations, because you can get, these topics can get really complicated and really messy very quickly. And using some of these theoretical policy models or economic development models, I think can be really useful in organizing your thoughts. So, that's probably, I'm not an expert in that area. It's not a model I have extensive familiarity with, but just using that as an example to show that's a common one that people use.
Yeah. I think that's an important point to think about frameworks and models we can use to kind of ground ourselves. We all have our lived experiences and our thoughts and opinions and emotions on these things a lot of times, but I think the theoretical frameworks to help ground these discussions are really important as well. So I'm going to give all of our panelists, say 1 minute, 1 to a minute and a half for kind of final thoughts. And then we're going to move forward with just wrapping up the webinar. So let's start with Dr. Hallmark, final thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I think one, fund rural communities and areas and people. 2, just be mindful of, when you are giving money to these areas, where the money's going to, it's actually going to them and not necessarily people that are, not located in them. And yeah, those are the main 2.
Great. Dr. Sansone?
Yeah, I think, I'm just really happy to have this conversation with the National Science Policy Network. I think it's, again, policy, particularly education policy in any of its realms, tends to have only urban-centric frames and urban-centric thoughts. And it's clear from the conversation today that rural geographies are unique, but even though they have some challenges, these are places with many assets and where wonderful scientists, are coming from. And so they're worthy of this conversation, and they need to be in these conversations when we talk about policy, particular science policy. So please don't forget rural regions when you're thinking about, supporting and bringing money into and valuing the work that's being done in these places.
Excellent. And Dr. Crain, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I would just underscore Dr. Sansone's point from earlier, which is, the immense diversity. She talked about kind of the diversity in general of the rural landscape, but in terms of the communities that make up and live in these spaces. And, we're really fortunate today to have Dr. Hallmark, who I know brings an Indigenous perspective, and Dr. Sansone, as she mentioned, who does research and brings a perspective of Latinx communities. There are a lot of scholars and researchers doing great work on Black communities and rural spaces. So I would just, circle back to that idea and underline that that those are important, and that's another way that we should be sort of rethinking our conversation around rural spaces is really that they're rich in diversity, rich in resources, and rich in assets. And I think that's a good point to end on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today, our panelists as well as our attendees, and thank you for letting me moderate this discussion as well. I've learned a lot. So let's go ahead, Jasmine, and put up that final slide. So this webinar was brought to you by the National Science Policy Network, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. You can email us dei@scipolnetwork.org for more information about the committee and what we do to advance early career professionals' understanding of intersectional policy topics and the actions that you can take. You can join us at our next committee meeting. It is next Tuesday, December 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific, and you can email the email there, the DEI email, for more information about how you can join that meeting. And we would encourage you to join us. Next slide, Jasmine. Join the National Science Policy Network. We are built by early career scholars for early career scholars in science policy. So if you want more information about science policy, advocacy, and diplomacy, please consider joining us. You can find National Science Policy Network on all of the platforms you see there, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube channel. And you will be able to find a recording of this webinar once it's all processed on our YouTube channel. And you can see our website link there as well. So thank you all again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in a future diversity discussion. And if you have any questions, like I said, please feel free to reach out to us on any of our